Hello and welcome to another author interview session with Earth.org. Today we're talking to Allister Thompson, who's the author of a forthcoming climate fiction novel, Birch and Jay. So very nice to
Happy
have
to
you here,
be
Allister.
happy to be here. Thanks a lot.
So we were just talking before we started about the literary world versus the environmental world. So I'd be interested to know, are you someone who came to writing climate fiction from a day job or from an earlier career as an environmentalist, or are you a writer who started writing about the climate? So which direction were you from?
Well, I'm actually a professional editor. So I've been editing full time for almost 30 years. I worked for publishers in Canada, and now I'm freelance, which allows me to live in a small town out of the way. And so I came to this very much from the book world, but it was really, I'd spent decades editing other people's work, advising them on their stories. And eventually I thought, well, it's a long time since I tried to write something. Maybe with all this knowledge I've accumulated, maybe I could actually do something halfway decent. And so that was why I wanted to write a book. But after that, I had to think of a topic, and then of course, what's important to me. I am a science fiction reader, yes, but what is the topic that I would want to write about that's most important to me? And of course, anybody who is conscious of environmentalism or has been for the last, as you can see, I'm not a young person. So I came to an environmental consciousness sort of in that wave in the late 80s and early 90s of young people getting passionate about, the ozone layer and acid rain. And, we heard of global warming, but we didn't really know what it meant. But, that was when I first became conscious of humanity's effect on the planet. And it's been sort of a downhill slope ever since for the planet and for humanity. So I had a lot of angst and anguish built up. And so that's why I chose to write climate fiction.
Well, speaking of the ozone layer, of course, the Montreal Protocol is something that happened in your nation, although not necessarily in your backyard. I take it from the book that you're from Ontario.
Yes, I was born in the UK, but I've lived in Canada for my whole life. I moved when I was 2. So I'm fully Canadian, and I grew up in the big city in Toronto, and I now live 3 hours north in a place called North Bay.
Ah, so the North Bay, which is transformed in the book into the community of Norbay, is actually the town you're living in now.
Yes, it is. Write what you know. That's the
Ah,
principle here.
very interesting, very interesting. And this is your first book?
I actually self-published an alternate history mystery novel a few years ago titled The Music of the Spheres, but this is my first traditionally published book.
Right. And was that also climate fiction or environmental fiction or sci-fi?
No, that was very much sci-fi. It was more about my cultural interests. I'm a musician, so that was very much about psychedelic rock musicians having adventures in an alternate 1968. It was more of a lark. I mean, there's a lot of socialist overtones and messaging in that, but that one was more
Hmm.
fun, and this one is quite serious.
So we talked about the topic that this book is, although it's set in Canada and set specifically in Ontario, where North Bay has become Norbay and Toronto has become Great Toronto. Uh,
Right.
so how universal do you think, or how universal is this book? Is it something that anybody can read from around the world, or is it something that you have to be a little bit immersed in Canadiana to understand or to appreciate?
Unquestionably, this is a universal message. You could take the events that are happening here and you could move it to, Berlin and a small town 3 hours from Berlin. It doesn't really matter. The events that are happening, the social and political events that have happened preceding the time of the story is set are happening everywhere and will happen everywhere. I mean, the different climatic effects, of course, remain to be seen. But you don't need to know anything about Canada to enjoy this story. And even, the cultural references, anybody over the age of 30 knows who Gordon Lightfoot was, I think. So, it's, and then on top of that, I mean, people around the world love British and American settings and don't have any problem reading those books. So I don't see why poor little Canada shouldn't get our moment as well.
I mean, as far as I've been able to tell, there's quite a strong literary scene and even environmental literary scene, if I can tie
Mm,
those two together in Canada.
very,
So
oh, very much so. Yeah.
take us through
Sorry.
the story. Tell us what happens, but no spoilers.
So the premise of the story, it's 100 years in the future. Well, actually, the the telling of the story is even further beyond that. But the actual events described are 100 years in the future. Climate collapse has occurred, and it's caused, massive negative effects, traumatic effects on humanity, leading to lawlessness, lack of governments, well, all the dystopian and post-apocalyptic things you can imagine, population decrease, but there is small communities scattered here and there, and my protagonist is from such a community, which is more organized and is based on certain principles. And so the community that he lives in also contains a guild of people whose goal is to preserve knowledge that is scattered all over the place for the purpose of, first of all, just archiving it and studying it, but also finding things that are useful that the people of the future can make use of. And so they go out on sort of adventures or field trips, I guess, to try to find what's left in university towns and archives, and this is sort of their guiding principle. So my character is sent off on his first such mission, more to just sort of get his feet wet and see what he can find and tour around the province because he's never really left town. And then he will meet various adventures, and along the way he will eventually meet the antagonists. So no spoilers there.
Right. Well, I think you always have to have an enemy in the book, otherwise there's no action. And it's a good tale. I mean, it's a good adventure story. I think something that certainly I would have liked. Well, I don't want to say I would have liked to read it when I was younger if this is what the world was going to be like in the future. But
Right.
it's the type of thing that an angsty teenager can definitely appreciate. Um, and so that also leads me to have a question. This is maybe not exclusive to young adult, but it's certainly an appropriate book for young adults. And that's a relatively narrow category. There are not that many cli-fi or climate fiction books for the young adult market. So what was your intent in writing this? Is it to educate or to inform or just write a good story that, teenagers would like and in the context of what's probably, a possibility for our future?
Well, interestingly, I did not write this for a specific audience. The publisher and the editor suggested to me that due to the age of the protagonists, a young adult category would be appropriate for it. And these days, young adult really does carry over into adult readership. I think probably the majority of readers of young adult are are adults now, as opposed to when I was young, when it was a very, very specific category of messaging books about the things you go through in life when you're
Mm.
in puberty. Now, young adult is a much bigger category. So I actually became enthused about that because there was the opportunity to educate. But the impetus to write this story was not about I want to tell a fun story and get published and make money. It was I have a lot of stuff I want to get off my chest. More, it was, well, a lot of people are probably doing this through their art these days. You want to go on record and have a testament of saying like there were people at this time.
Mm.
You might not be able to tell if you're a historian of the future. You may not be able to tell, but there were people who knew what was going on and what could see it happening around us, and we tried to warn other people,
Mm.
maybe ineffectually. And so I wanted to go on record. I've done that in music as well. I've written many songs on environmental themes, and so I just wanted to get that testament down. And then when it was done, I thought, well, I think I may have actually done all right with this, and I think this is a half decent story. So I'm going to try to get it published. And then everything else about the audience came from that. So I don't know if it's specifically about educating people, but I do want it to be thoughtful enough that the reader starts to question certain premises that maybe they don't question about consumerism, about
Mm.
humanity's relationship to the planet and the other things on it. And if it makes them think about those things and reconsider some of their own choices, then it will be
Mhm.
successful.
There are things even like vegetarianism, which are raised in the book. I think the community in Norbay are all vegetarians,
That's
and
right.
that's obviously a major contributor of greenhouse gases is the animal husbandry industry. So it's an obvious choice, but it's not one that is, I'd say, very well known outside the environmental community.
And with every kind of premise like this, there may be a certain suspension of disbelief necessary because I'm sure people will say, oh, well, these people are trying to survive. Well, they're not just going to eat beans, they're going to go kill deer. Well, I've constructed this community of being a bunch of people who have a certain set of principles that
Mm.
they adhere to, but it's mentioned also that they don't force other people to do that either.
Mhm.
If you live in the community and want to have a different kind of diet, that's up to you. But yes, they are putting, deep ecological principles into practice, and I wanted to show people doing that, that it was possible to do that.
Mm. That brings me to ask a question about the community itself. When I read this book, I really got the feeling that these knowledge seekers from Norway owed something of their existence to other religious communities. So people like the Mennonites, perhaps, or even the Mormons, because the Latter-day Saints people, they send their 19-year-olds out on missions for 2 years as part of their belief system. And I wondered if that played any role in shaping this fictional community of knowledge seekers.
Well, actually, it was funny that you say that because it didn't. And I would actually be sort of at pains to say that this is very much not a religious community. It's more one formed originally by circumstance. It was
Mm.
founded by people who were released from concentration camps where climate refugees and dissidents were held as teens. And while they were in those camps, they would sit and talk about the things that had happened and say, if we ever get out of here, we're going to be different. We're going to try and live it in a different way. So there is that principle, but it was more that they needed to go somewhere and find somewhere where they would be safe to settle down, and that's where they ended up. But having said that, once you mentioned that, I could start to see some of the parallels. And in North America, as you know, there were persecuted groups from Europe, like Doukhobors and
Mm.
people like that, who settled feeling that this is a place where they could have freedom and safety. So, yeah, I mean, interestingly, I spent a year I think it was fourth grade, living in Salt Lake City because my
Oh,
father
right.
was a university professor and he had a sabbatical year. So we lived in Utah for a year. So I don't know if maybe something sunk in subliminally there, but yeah, I didn't actually see that parallel until you mentioned it.
The idea of a mission perhaps could have sunk
Yeah,
in
yeah,
somehow through your year in Salt Lake City. I mean, I may just be thinking of that because I read another Canadian book recently by Cameron Duke, who is a called Menomoto. He took a motorcycle journey from his own Mennonite community in Canada and went south and visited Mennonite communities all over South America. And um, that came with some quite, this is a real life, I mean, this is a nonfiction book.
right,
So that could have been just on my mind. But it's definitely shares features of isolated communities around the world, whether or not they are knowledge seekers through some religious way or through a scientific or a moral, um, for a moral reason. The
right.
other thing I think was quite interesting about the book is that it does raise a lot of philosophical questions, often through the voice of the elder speaking to the 19 and 20-year-olds who are on these adventures. Um, what kind of society really works? What's practical? Is this what you want to do? How do you form relationships? Who are you as a person? And I was wondering, why did you choose to put this element in this book?
Well, it flows a lot from the first person narrative, and the idea of elders, because oral tradition is very important in traditional cultures and indigenous cultures. So if I'm looking at a post-technological future, the continuity of the oral transmission of these stories would be important. So I thought, well, how about if my character is an elder telling a group of people just like he was, you know,
Mm.
how many decades before the story? And so the concept of elders is very important, as you know from reading it. There are a couple of wise and experienced elders who are dropping these little nuggets of wisdom because they grew up in a time, sort of the end of the time that we live in now.
Hmm.
So they saw the consumerist culture and they saw the denialism of climate change. And now they're living in an entirely different world and they're able to impart the lessons. So it is very much about those elders imparting lessons. And that's something that is vanishing from our world. Elders are no longer
Mm.
respected in Western society. So is maybe a restoration of that. And I was inspired by North American indigenous concepts and society in that.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Do you hope that this book would go some way towards helping to restore the interest by younger people in the oral tradition of elders?
Well, I have thought about that, and I mean, I am pretty pleased with myself actually that I came up with that because I didn't go into this with any plans. I just started coming up with characters and assigning characteristics
Mhm.
to them. I am proud that the elderly people in the story are strong, and
Mm,
I don't just mean mentally strong. You know, one of them is cycling around Ontario, and the other one is still the leader of the community. And I don't want to place unreasonable expectations on seniors that they should all be dynamos like that. And my own mother really resents that when she sees ads of 80-year-olds skydiving and things like that. She says, I shouldn't have to be like that. I want to get up at 10 o'clock in the morning. I'm going to do it. And I say, yes, Mom, I understand. But, you know, the idea that an older person should sort of abdicate their responsibilities or, you know,
mm.
assume that because their body is breaking down, that they no longer have the ability to lead or to teach. And you see that happening with seniors as well. Once you get to a point where you decide you're done, that you're broken down,
Mm.
that's when your decline starts. And so these people are still vital and they're still passing on the wisdom and the information the way an elder should. So I think there need to be more examples of that in art.
I thought the teenagers in the book actually showed quite a lot of patience when listening to their elders lecture. But this might be
I guess that's what they're taught, yes, in the community.
well, this is a post-internet world as well, so they don't have
Right.
anything to distract them from the words of wisdom. You know, the whole story, as you mentioned, it takes place about 100 years in the future, but the that's where the main action takes place. But it is itself a story by the titular characters who are speaking from an additional 50 years in the future. And that structure is something a little bit unusual. Tell me more about that structure and why did you choose that way of telling the story and why is that meaningful to you?
Well, like I said, it really was a product of the choice of telling this through a very intimate first person. And then I thought, well, he has to be telling somebody this. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. You know, he hasn't typed up a book. So, you know, I mean, it was really, it just flowed from that. And then the idea of continuity, that there was knowledge was being passed down. So
Right.
that's where it all came from.
On the other hand, the fact that it's, I suppose, 70 something year old Birch and Jay in the first chapter lets you know that they made it. They didn't.
Yeah, and I thought about that. You know, it is kind of giving some stuff away, but I left, you know, some enough clues that there's things that are going to follow this plot, and I've already written the sequel, so I know what happens. Um, Everything's going to work out all right for these people, but it's going to be a bit of a journey to get there because um, I don't necessarily. I have a bit of an issue with the way art is focused on trauma these days, and sometimes just writing a story about nice people trying hard and then everything working out for them. I don't really see anything
Mhm.
wrong with that, and that's sort of vanished from a culture that's obsessed with flawed heroes experiencing multiple traumas. If you watch most TV shows and movies, that's basically what's being presented to us as interesting content. And you know, every now and then it's just nice to know that your characters are going to do the right thing and they may end up okay.
I mean, I definitely am. I'm with you there. The idea that we don't want to focus too much on the trauma, but more on the possibility of a happy ending. And although this is set in a very much of dystopian future, I mean, you've already spoken about it. There is more to come. These people are coming back from that dystopian future, is the feeling I got. But tell me more about what to expect from the next books, because this does seem very clearly to be the beginning of a series.
I'm projecting a trilogy, and the publisher has indicated interest in that. So I did work hard over the winter to do a sequel. And so the sequel will have two aspects, one of which continues on with the main conflict from this book with the antagonist and resolving that.
Mhm.
The other half of it is going to be a flashback of a sort, a backstory to one of the elders when she was
Mm.
young and the things she was living through around, you know, 2045, 2050. So we can actually see the things she was talking about happening. And that actually was, you know, traumatic to write about because of
Mm.
the, you know, what the characters had experienced. But that's one thing I really wanted this book to be about. Yes, it's about climate collapse, but it's not really. It's about the social and political effects of climate collapse and the things that we're seeing now. The migrant crisis that we see now is just a tiny little fragment of what's to come as climate refugees start flooding all over the place eventually. And it has to happen. It's guaranteed to happen. So what are we going to do? Well, all signs suggest that our Western countries are not going to handle this well. They're not going to be welcoming, and they're going to, make the worst possible choices and cause incalculable suffering. So I wanted the second book cheerfully to delve into that. The third book, I'm hoping to do something a bit more elegant and literary with to wrap the story up satisfyingly for all these characters, but I'm sort of in the outlining stage for that.
Right. Okay. So you have to read the third book to really get to the Battle of Endor and everyone celebrating in the street.
Actually, the battle will be in the second novel. The third one may not have too much conflict, and maybe one of those ones that's just all lovely and poetic and all that.
It
So
can happen. It can happen. I mean, as you mentioned, a lot of the um, not just the conflict, but the consequences of climate change are described not only in a geophysical way, but also in a political way. And I wondered to what extent did you really, do a deep dive into the research on this versus is this kind of from your own perspective, just seeing what's around you and reading the news?
I would say politically, it's definitely from my own viewpoints, and obviously, I'm a very keen news watcher, and I've been like you have, and anybody else, been watching
Mm.
these things develop. And I wrote this in 2023, and in the last 2 years, like anybody who's witnessed something, and a few years ago, we see it starting to actually happen, and it's not hard to predict. It doesn't mean that I'm a seer or special. I mean, anybody who is conscious of these things can see them. Um, so as an astute political watcher, I think, and social, I think about social issues a lot. I didn't do much research. I didn't feel it was that necessary. In terms of climate stuff, that's very difficult because as
Mm.
we know that it's happening, but there's different models as to how these things will happen because the Earth's climate is incredibly complex and we actually know fairly little about it. We know fairly little about most things. We think we know
Mm.
a lot, but we don't. So we know that there's going to be terrible, cataclysmic things that are going to happen. We don't necessarily know where they will happen and in what way exactly. So I mean, I did when I came up with an idea, I would go and look into the climate research and say, well, is this possible? Is this something that is this plausible that this particular kind of like a forest fires or that kind of thing, will that happen? Could it happen? So I did that kind of research, but in terms of the political stuff, I must admit I arrogantly leaned on my my own opinions and observations.
Right. The book itself, where will we be able to get the book once it's out on May 24th?
Well, hypothetically, everywhere. The online retailers will have it. The publishers, Latitude 46, will have it, and I believe will ship internationally. But it should be available everywhere. I don't know how long it'll take to get to people, but once it's shipped. But and of course, this would be an EPUB as well for instant purchase from all the retailers. So
Anywhere,
I'm
anywhere good
but
books are sold, you'll be able to find it. How's
yeah,
that?
that's the hope. Yes.
Right. And I'm looking forward to seeing it on the shelves when it comes out. And for those of you who have forgotten by the end of this discussion what the name of the book was, it's called Birch and Jay, and the author is Allister Thompson. Looking forward to the book coming out, and best of luck with the sequels.
Thank you very much.